RSPCA, a lot of people don't know this, but it was set up 192 years ago by an MP. And it was set up to do two things. One was to change the legislation and to enforce the legislation, which is why we have our inspectors. And the other thing was to educate people who have animals so that they know how to look after them properly. And I'm here now, 192 years later, doing the political role, trying to still persuade politicians to improve the legislation. And amazingly, 194 years after the first legislation was put in place on animals, which was the first one not only in England but also the first one probably in the world, we are still doing that job 194 years later.
And which one was this?
So the first piece of legislation was passed in 1822, and it was on protecting cattle because the MP who set us up and passed this particular piece of legislation walked past Smithfields every day on his way to Parliament. And when he walked past Smithfields then was, as is now, one of the largest cattle markets in the world. Obviously now it's all refrigerated lorries that turn up, but when he was there, obviously this was before the car was invented, before railways were invented, and you literally drove your sheep and your cows all the way from Norfolk, the north, into London. And he saw some horrendous conditions of people driving their cattle, their sheep, through the streets, hitting them, beating them. And he decided then that this was not right and things had to change. And that's when he introduced this first piece of legislation, which was called Martin's Law, after him.
Wow. So are there any laws that we're working on at the moment to get legislated?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, tomorrow the government are producing their new law on pet licensing and selling of pets. So this is it just shows you that you can always improve legislation. Our legislation on pet animals is 65 years old. So so obviously well before the days of the internet, well before the days of how most people get a dog now. 65 years ago, people used to go to a pet shop.
Yes.
Now they click on the internet, turn their computer on, and they can get an animal instantly. And obviously that's good in some respects because it means that they can get an animal quite quickly. But it's bad in our respect because it means they don't actually think: do they want that animal? Yeah. Do they know how to look after that animal?
And the home's not vetted.
Where is it coming from?
What conditions?
And amazingly, you could go on the computer now and you could get virtually every dog or cat or even some exotic animals. You wouldn't know what you were doing with them. No. They don't come in with instructions. No. If you were buying a fridge or a cooker, it would come with instructions. Indeed. You'd read them and then you'd plug it in. Yeah. Now you just get this live living animal and you're going, what do I do with this? Yeah. And that's unfortunate because if you don't know what you're doing with the animal, then sometimes you can get into trouble. You don't know how to look after it. You don't know the exercise it needs, the food it needs.
Absolutely.
And that's unfortunately when the RSPCA comes in because we get 1.2 million calls a year from the public saying, I think this person doesn't know how to look after their animal.
And do you ever have the actual owner come in and pretty much surrender and say, I can't do this anymore, here's a lizard in maybe a box, in the rehoming centres? Do you have that a lot?
Yeah, it's not a lot, mostly because people are embarrassed when, you imagine that you've got this animal, you thought you knew what you were doing, and actually you don't, and that's where you get people abandoning their animal. And although it's illegal to abandon dogs, people do so. They will tie them up outside our centres. And we found, even with some very unusual animals, so for instance, in the last few years we've had bearded dragons, which is a type of reptile which can grow up to a fairly good size, although when you get it, it's a baby and it's quite small. We found some of those just straying, walking across playing fields on their own in the middle of nowhere.
That's cruel.
Yes, completely. But people have abandoned them because they don't understand how to look after them. They're embarrassed to admit it. They don't want to hand it over to us because we may ask them questions. And so they just let it go. So you can, instead of just having a stray dog or a stray cat, you now have stray bearded dragons. So the RSPCA is still working on the same parameters that we were when we were set up in 1824, which is improve animal welfare by legislation. And we still have examples. I've given you an example of how tomorrow the government is changing the law on how we buy and sell pets. But also change the way that people think, change their behaviour. Yeah. And we're still doing exactly those two things 192 years later. The good news is that we've got a fairly good piece of legislation now that covers most animals. We still have improvements to do, and the example of the law, which is 65 years old tomorrow, is a good example. But the problems that we face now that our Victorian ancestors didn't face, like the internet, like this instant gratification, that actually in some respects has made our job more difficult, because who knew that the internet was going to be here when the Pet Animal Act was introduced in 1951? Nobody knew that. And so you have to respond to that, and you always have to update, change, and amend the way you're doing things. But those two things, legislation and people's behaviour, are still the same mantra that we've used all our lives.
Yeah. And lastly, what advice would you give to a potential pet owner out there, to a family maybe that wants to adopt via the RSPCA or buy a puppy? What would you instill in them?
Well, the first thing I would say is getting a pet, getting a companion, whether it's a dog or a cat or a bearded dragon or whatever. They are fantastic for you if you know what you're doing. Okay. We have got fairly good research which shows that they're good companions, particularly for elderly people. They do have some health benefits. They will reduce your blood pressure, so they're fantastic things. Okay. And of course, dogs make you exercise because you have to take them out for walks. So they are great for you, and they are, for many people, they are a real companion, a real friend. But before you do that, make sure that you know what you're doing. The RSPCA would always say that getting a pet is a responsibility. It's not a right. So think about what you're getting, do your research, and if you then have made your mind up to it, then come and talk to us, because we've got virtually every animal that you could imagine. We've got bearded dragons, we've got obviously dogs, cats, rabbits that are all looking for their homes. They've all had traumatic lives. They've all been through difficult things. But the one thing that I always love with animals is that they never lose their trust of human beings. They always think that you're going to be the one to give them that great home, that great opportunity. And we are a matchmaking service. We are trying to match those animals to you.
I love that.
So come and talk to us. We will give you the animal that you want if you've got the right attitude and you've got the right conditions. And the animal will be happy, you'll be happy, and we will have a match made in heaven.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much.